Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you, Della. Yes, it's a long title, the Hasselplatten Institute of Design Thinking at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. The D School is kind of how we refer to it. Essentially, we focus on teaching design thinking and looking at incorporating that into several curricula within the university and then also within industry. So I'm going to be speaking today a little bit about some of the sort of lessons that I've learned through these explorations around design thinking, around various solutions that I've seen within the South African and African ecosystem, and then some of the principles that I've sort of adopted from that and bring into my own work. So, like Della said, I'm from South Africa. This is really a land of diversity, and I think one of the biggest challenges is how we can turn this diversity and recognize it and turn it into these capabilities and opportunities within industry. You know, 11 official languages, one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. It's a very diverse country, and for the last sort of 24 years, we've been working to create a more inclusive country. I think there's a lot of challenges that we still need to improve on. And in sort of skills development and education, where I sit, this is kind of the key focus. And I think there's two challenges that have been highlighted. So the one is, how do we become globally competitive? You know, although we're right at the tip of Africa, we're very sort of focused on international and global work and trade. But then also, how do we take in consideration our local context with massive unemployment? And how do we look at creating skills around that space as well? And so we often work within these two spaces. And this is really interesting for us as well, where we can one day work with large international organizations and then the next day work with youth around sort of entrepreneurship, around job creation more than job development, or kind of getting people job ready. So focusing on skills development, there's several things that we often need to take into consideration. There's obviously our inadequate quality of basic education. We also have these triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And there's often the skills mismatch, increasingly at tertiary level. We see this also because of the changing workplace, you know, and this with the advent of this digital revolution and sort of the fourth industrial revolution coming through, we're often training students for jobs that don't exist yet. And so we need to create more adaptable students that are leaving the education system, students that can move between jobs within the industry and not just within single trajectories. I think currently there's sort of people are changing jobs between 3 to 7 times in their lifetime, whereas previously they'd often sort of study something and then you go into a position and that's your position and you progress, you know, through that organization. But now people are also moving across organizations or even within an organization, and there's also this constant need to upskill as well, even once you're in a job. And so we're seeing this sort of I guess, this focus on entrepreneurship and even intrapreneurship within organizations, as well as preparing people for jobs. And so if we look at sort of this changing landscape and the future of jobs, essentially there's kind of this shift towards these 3 top skills that are becoming increasingly important. We're looking at complex problem solving, and I think that's essentially where design thinking plays an increasingly important role around complex problem solving and wicked problems, wicked challenges. And then this balance of critical thinking and creativity. It's not either or, but it's actually embodying both. And so if we look at design thinking, we see this skill set developing where it sits between this intuitive and analytical thinking, coming up with ideas, but then also managing to sort of focus on them and critically examine them and look for this reliability as well. And so I think this design thinking lends itself really well to training people for job readiness and for this sort of fourth industrial revolution. Often the challenges that we work on, we face in South Africa and then therefore work on within the design thinking program, because we need to be contextually relevant, are around these complex and wicked challenges. Often challenges that define definition and don't necessarily have an outcome. And these are sort of the spaces that we work. And so we often work with organizations, government, NGOs around these sort of challenges and multiple stakeholders. So just a bit of background on the D School. The first D School started at Stanford University in the US, and then several years later in Potsdam University. And then 2.5 years ago, we started D School in Cape Town. It's the first one in the Southern Hemisphere, the first one in Africa. And it's really, I think our main goal was to look at contextualizing design thinking on the continent and within South Africa. A lot of the tools that have been developed within the North. And so a big challenge of ours was to say, okay, well, this is design thinking, and this is where all the books are coming out. But what is it in South Africa? What does it mean for us? And so a lot of work that we've done is really about developing, I think, a lot more around that sort of understanding empathy phase, understanding each other and the diversity within teams before trying to actually understand challenges. And so how we frame design thinking is this blend between a method, a mindset, and eventually a culture. We approach it through teaching of methods and tools, and the more that people do this, the more it becomes embodied, and the more it becomes a mindset and a way of doing things. That understanding of empathy first. Let's listen before I talk. Let's understand a challenge through your perspective and through the different perspectives before I tell you what my perspective is. And how can these different perspectives impact how we understand these complex challenges from many viewpoints? And so that diversity of thought is incredibly important. And then, like I said, the more that we do this, and the more people that do this, the more we can look at creating a culture of innovation, of design thinking, and of creativity. We sort of base our design thinking model on the one that emerged out of Potsdam University. We see empathy as this common thread that runs through the entire process. It's not just something that you do on day one, and then you move on to the next step. Empathy is critical, and it's a golden thread of design thinking. So through understanding, we look at understanding each other within a team. Who's in this challenge? What are our different backgrounds, our worldviews, our sort of mental models? How do we see and experience this challenge that we're working on? And let's understand that together. Then we begin to understand the challenge. We move through to the sort of understanding of the context together through observations, interviews, as we know in design thinking, and then that reframing of the challenge through the lens of people affected by it. And then through the ideation, prototype, test, sort of rapid iterations. Today, I really want to focus more on the problem-finding side. And I think this is increasingly important and becoming more of a critical skill. And we're seeing this a lot within industry, where people are looking for problem finders as well as problem solvers. But increasingly important is we're looking for people who can actually identify challenges and turn those into opportunities. And this is increasingly important in the entrepreneurship space as well, where people often see these things as challenges, but just being able to flip that challenge into an opportunity opens up many more opportunities. And so today I'm going to be mainly focusing on sort of problem-finding space and this idea of understanding and observation and my experience within this space. So I've always liked this quote by Albert Einstein. He said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend about 55 minutes trying to understand the problem and 5 minutes talking about the solution. And I think this is where design thinking sits as well. If we can spend more time really getting to grips with what the challenges are, and I love that opening activity that Della led, the why. The more we ask why, the deeper we go to understanding challenges. And really sort of what are the underlying aspects of it? What are the challenges behind the challenges or the problems behind the problems? We often see the result of challenges as the challenge itself. But in fact, if we grapple with it more, we can focus far more on targeted sort of aspects of that. And so just some observations of various sort of, case studies that I've seen. So South Africa has this legacy of exclusion. And that's led to a largely unbanked, specifically in the banking area, largely unbanked population. People were excluded from actually buying land, owning land, starting businesses, working, and what have you. And so they developed a lot of their own ways of actually managing money. And these existed outside of the sort of formal economy. And then as we sort of moved into the formal economy and more inclusion, there's still these extremely high banking fees. In fact, we have some of the highest banking fees in the world. And so this led to the start of these stokvels. And I'm not too sure if there's something similar in Ghana, but essentially it's community members getting together, contributing to try and look at buying larger purchases that one couldn't necessarily buy on their own. They align around a common purpose, and there's a strong social context. And sometimes people belong to several of these stokvels. In South Africa, there's over 800,000 of these. They mainly focus on savings, but also around burial, large purchases, these large costs, unforeseen costs, and how do we actually engage with them? And it's really through understanding these sort of grassroots solutions that people have come up with and developed over time that we can inform us really as to what the real needs and aspirations of people are. I think through that observation and looking at how people are solving their own challenges based on the constraints that have been sort of imposed or that one experiences, one can really begin to understand what the real needs of people are and the aspirations. And then we also face a large challenge of squatter camps where we have these generally 23 shacks burned down every day. And this is a major, major challenge in South Africa. And it has been for a long time. And what we're seeing now are people actually really understanding this space, trying to actually engage with it. Because I think before, people couldn't engage with the space or didn't know what really to do. And we're seeing some sort of more community-centered solutions emerging, based on social enterprise, based on really trying to understand the challenges and developing solutions that expand far beyond just seeing it as a problem. And the one great example of this that's emerged is Lumkani, which essentially is a heat sensor, and you sort of taps into the Internet of Things and links several houses together. And it notifies one's neighbor if around that fire, because neighbors can respond far quicker than public services around fire. And this has also enabled a lot of people who live in these informal settlements to actually insure their homes, which was totally inaccessible beforehand. And so it's this interesting blend into that space. And so understanding, again, these larger community challenges can really inform us about a lot of latent market needs at scale, and really help to look at bringing that social consciousness into a lot of business development as well, linking the two together. I think in South Africa as well, and throughout Africa, there's this high rate of migrant work. And a great solution that we've seen in this space, it's been going for quite a while now, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it, is M-Pesa, which is the branchless banking service. And I think what's really interesting about this space is that it didn't emerge from the sort of financial space, but rather from the telecommunication space. And this is where a lot of disruption is beginning to happen, not necessarily within the space of focus, like within, for example, finance disrupting finance, but how mobile might disrupt finance. And we're seeing a lot of interlinking of this. It's one of the most successful mobile-based financial services. And essentially, it also comes from observing people. How are people misusing a product? For example, the cell phone airtime wasn't designed for this, but it's how people have begun to use it. And that's really interesting. In design, we often talk about designing for use, misuse, and abuse. And it's actually through that misuse that we really learn about the real needs of people and how people would really like to engage with a product or a service. So it brings us back to that understanding and that observation. It's really engaging with people and seeing how people actually use products and potential products and how we might learn from that to provide better services and more appropriate services. And the advent of new technologies, as we sort of speak about this globalization, we're increasingly seeing the abilities to sort of leapfrog and these opportunities that are opened up through new technologies, not having to rely on the same sort of slow progress of other economies, but how we can leapfrog over certain economies. If we look at the fintech landscape in South Africa, I think it's one of the sort of largest in the world. There's a lot of the edtech landscape as well. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we have this high unemployment rate. People don't just walk into a job. And so we have a lot of entrepreneurs by circumstance rather than by choice. People need to become entrepreneurs because they don't necessarily have a job. I read an interesting article the other day listening to around sort of Finland's edtech and fintech startup space. And it only really started in 2008 after the massive sort of financial crash where people suddenly lost jobs and didn't have jobs. And that gave birth to their fintech space, or their sort of tech space. Whereas in South Africa, it's been this sort of slow development over time, and we're at a point now where we've got this really rich understanding. And the great thing about a lot of these fintechs is that they'll identify a single challenge out there that these large organizations are trying to solve, and they'll do it better because they understand the challenge better. They're also more agile. And so we've seen this massive development of fintech space, and also moving to actually understand the real sort of financial challenges of people. And I think this idea of leapfrogging over sort of slow technologies or other technologies really allows us to enable more trade and more entrepreneurship. So it feeds back into that understanding of competing on a global scale, as well as developing local skills and actually understanding local challenges. And then the final example actually comes from sort of big industries. And I think it's a great example of how big industries often misunderstand or misread communities or people. And so this was a an attempt to try and sort of bank what they call the unbanked. There's a large, about 55% of the population is unbanked, but I think it's about 43 billion rand is sort of not within the financial system. And so this was an attempt by the large banks to really try and look at providing a service for the unbanked, where they'd reduce fees across all ATMs, and then so people could access money cheaper. However, they refer to it as banking for the poor. Okay. The poor don't see themselves as poor. They see themselves as more from an aspirational level. And so there's this misalignment of how corporations or industry can sometimes see people and how people see themselves. And this is like critical to design thinking and empathy. If we see this empathy as a starting point and as the golden thread, it's understanding people through their own lens. And they frame it differently to how people who experience the challenge actually see themselves and see the problem. And so it's becoming, it's critical to understand how people see themselves. If we're wanting to look at producing products that are appropriate for people to actually help them reach their aspirations, and so that sort of benefit both sides, it's increasingly important to see how people see themselves. And so this first half of design thinking, I think, is where a lot of sort of work needs to happen, and where we're putting a lot of effort in, is really to try and understand these different perspectives. Understand that diversity in the room, how people see the world differently. How do we, because diverse teams can also often face quite a bit of conflict because we see things differently. And what we need to try and what we try to do is look at how that diversity is actually a good thing. And how do we do that? And design thinking actually provides a common language for diverse teams to come together quicker. Because often there's quite a slow start when we work in very diverse teams. There's this difference between how we frame challenges, how we experience challenges. But design thinking provides a sort of great sort of common language. And then to actually spend some time observing and really experiencing the space. I think often we see design agencies or agency hired to solve a problem for another business or what have you, but they don't necessarily engage with the space. And so it goes straight into problem solving. But problem finding is critical. And then again, understanding how people see themselves is also critical to actually developing the right kind of problem, sort of solutions to these challenges. And how do we include everybody's voice in the process as well? So I get some of the lessons and principles that we've begun to adopt, or that we've adopted over time from the design thinking space, is to really look at exploring what people do and why. Again, it comes down to that why. Okay. The great thing about design is that it's not just there to meet needs, but it can also tap into aspirations. So it's not just what are your needs now and how do we solve those and how do we look at helping people now, but say where do people want to get to and how can design help elevate people to where people want to go. So it ties into those aspirations. To really explore the challenges that people face from their perspective as well. To understand how people see their current and future selves. The challenges of today, if we look at this sort of these ecosystems from a very systemic perspective, as we change one thing, there's this big knock-on effect within this ecosystem. And then that creates other challenges. And so we need to constantly look at how we engage with these ecosystems. And so it's very important to see how people see themselves now, but how they see themselves in the future, and how one can assist people in getting to that space. And then, so we start from that lens of desirability, really looking at understanding people's needs and aspirations, and then bringing in the technology and the business aspects around that. Rather than starting with a technology solution or a business strategy and then trying to push that onto a market or try and find fit, start with people first. It's that human-centered approach that is so critical within design thinking. And then to look at designing products and processes that help people do what they do, so understanding sort of cultural practices, work practices, and what they want to do, and how do we help people do that better? Okay. If people want to transfer money, send money home, how do we help people do that at lower cost, more easily, more efficiently? If people need to move between two spaces, how do we allow people to do that in a more efficient way? And so these learnings have sort of, I guess, affected how we look at the design thinking sort of innovation Venn diagram. I'm not too sure how many people are familiar with that, where you have sort of desirability, viability, and feasibility. And essentially, it's starting with that desirability. What are the real needs and aspirations of people? How do we then look at, for example, if we're in the startup space, we're within a large industry, how do we look at that fit within what we do? Okay, that idea fit. Will it also take off within this organization? Can we try and meet these needs? Then moving into that business viability, does it make sense business-wise? Does this tie into our existing business strategies, or do we need to develop new business strategies around this idea or this opportunity? Also understanding people's technology, capabilities and preferences. Often we'll see large organizations, especially, we need to come up with a new digital strategy, and that's sometimes misaligned from the real needs of people. And so how do we align business strategy with the real needs of people? And again, where people see themselves and their future selves. So it's looking at now, but it's also looking at down the line. And so how do we understand and develop these business technology strategies that align with the real needs of people and where sort of society is moving? Testing that within that feasibility space, and then again moving through that iteration back into testing with people again. We don't just go through the design thinking process linearly and sort of say, okay, at the end of this, because it's an innovation process, we're going to come up with an innovative solution. It's really about testing and validating our ideas that emerge, and testing that against or with people that we're actually trying to understand and work with better. And so we see this sort of innovation at the center of these three spheres, but starting critically with what the needs and aspirations of people are. And I think the key sort of semantic shift that design thinking takes is not just about efficiencies and designing things right, but actually designing the right thing. So it's really about effectiveness over efficiency. First, let's understand the real challenge. First, let's understand that this is a real challenge we're trying to solve and that needs solving. And then we can focus on how do we do that and how do we do that well. Often we focused, I think, on just doing the right thing. How do we apply lean and how do we make this the most effective way possible? But in fact, what we need to really look at doing is designing the right thing first. Thank you.